7 children vanished from a school bus in 2010. 15 years later, storm ice reveals something that should never have surfaced. The morning sun caught the edges of 7 small backpacks protruding from the fractured glacier, like grave markers breaking through snow. Senior Forest Service Ranger Elijah Harper had walked this stretch of Elk Glacier every March for 25 years, documenting ice retreat patterns and wildlife migration routes. The ritual never changed, boots crunching across the frost-hardened snow, breath forming white clouds in the thin mountain air, clipboard ready to record another year of climate data that told the same depressing story of accelerating melt. March 15, 2025, had started like any other survey day until the record spring thaw revealed what the mountain had been hiding in its frozen belly for 15 years. Harper knelt beside the nearest backpack, a faded purple Disney princess design, with straps still perfectly intact despite a decade and a half buried in ice. The fabric looked impossibly fresh, as if a child had dropped it yesterday during recess. Through the clear front pocket, he could see a homework assignment with neat pencil markings and a date that made his stomach clench. December 14, 2010. His weathered hands trembled as he reached for his radio. Harper had lived in Clearwater County long enough to remember the search helicopters that circled these peaks for months after School Bus 12 vanished, with 7 children aboard. He remembered the candlelight vigils, the volunteer search parties, the families who never stopped believing their children might walk through the front door. The case had divided the community between those who accepted the tragic accident theory and those who whispered about something darker lurking in the mountain's shadows. After 18 months of fruitless searching, the official investigation had quietly closed, leaving behind only questions and broken hearts. Now, Harper found himself counting backpacks scattered across 30 yards of exposed glacial ice. 7 total, all child-sized, all carrying the impossible date that had haunted him for years. The purple Disney pack belonged to a girl who would have been 25 years old now if she had lived to see this spring morning. He keyed his radio with shaking fingers, knowing that his next words would shatter the fragile peace that families had built around their grief. Dispatch, this is Ranger Harper at Elk Glacier Monitoring Station. I need immediate response to GPS coordinates 39.7392, 105.8372. I've discovered what appears to be evidence from the 2010 school bus case. The static crackled back, followed by a dispatcher's voice, tight with disbelief. Harper, did you say the 2010 case, the missing children? Harper stared at the backpacks emerging from the ice like artifacts from a tomb that should never have been opened. Climate change had turned him into an unwilling archaeologist of tragedies, and he realized he was looking at evidence from the most haunting unsolved case in Colorado history. Evidence that should have stayed buried forever, but the warming planet had other plans. The ice cracked like rifle shots echoing across the valley as another house-sized section of Elk Glacier calved into the meltwater lake 200 feet below. Dr. Ingrid Schultz pressed her binoculars against the weather station's frost-covered window, documenting what she knew would become the largest single ice loss event in the glacier's recorded history. Her laptop displayed temperature readings that should have been impossible for mid-March: 58 degrees Fahrenheit at 11,000 feet elevation, 17 degrees above the historical average. The previous night's storm had been a meteorological anomaly, a warm Pacific system that dumped rain instead of snow across the high country. The combination of warm air and liquid precipitation had accelerated the spring melt by at least 3 weeks, creating conditions she had only witnessed in her most pessimistic climate models. Schultz had spent 12 years studying this particular glacier, measuring its relentless retreat as global warming slowly revealed the mountain's buried history. Usually, the ice surrendered mundane secrets: rusted mining equipment from the 1880s gold rush, animal bones from ancient avalanches, occasionally an arrowhead or pottery shard from indigenous hunting camps. Never anything connected to the case that still woke her up some nights when the wind howled through the research station. Her satellite phone buzzed with an incoming text from Ranger Harper. Need immediate glaciology consultation at GPS coordinates 39.7392, 105.8372. Found multiple artifacts related to 2010 school bus disappearance. Ice preservation appears complete. Schultz lowered her binoculars and felt the familiar knot of dread that had lived in her stomach since moving to Clearwater County. She had been a graduate student in 2010, young and idealistic, convinced that science could answer any question if you collected enough data. The disappearance of Bus 12 had taught her that some mysteries defied explanation, no matter how sophisticated your instruments. Her phone exploded with notifications as she grabbed her field equipment. Someone with a cell phone had already captured footage of Harper's discovery, and the video was spreading across social media platforms like wildfire. The caption read, "Breaking missing kids' backpacks found in glacier after 15 years. This is not a drill." Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram. The story was everywhere within minutes, accompanied by grainy photos of colorful fabric emerging from white ice. News outlets would descend on the county like locusts within hours, and Sheriff Cassandra Reed would face the media circus that had destroyed her predecessor's career. Schultz shouldered her pack and headed for the door, knowing that her expertise in glacial preservation would soon be tested in ways no textbook had prepared her for. The mountain was finally releasing its secrets, and she wasn't sure the living were ready to hear what the ice had been whispering all these years. Sheriff Cassandra Reed's boots crunched across the glacier's surface as she approached the most important crime scene of her career, 15 years too late. The perimeter established by Ranger Harper and her 3 advanced deputies looked like an archaeological dig interrupted by tragedy. Yellow evidence tape fluttered in the mountain wind, creating a sterile boundary around 7 small backpacks that emerged from the ice like flowers blooming in a graveyard. Reed had been elected sheriff 3 years ago on a platform of modernizing the department's investigative capabilities, but nothing in her training had prepared her for processing evidence that defied the laws of decomposition. Each backpack had been photographed from multiple angles, tagged with GPS coordinates, and documented according to the same protocols she used for fresh crime scenes. The preservation was unsettling in its completeness. Deputy Martinez handed her the preliminary inventory list, his usually steady hands showing a slight tremor. Ranger Harper didn't disturb anything beyond visual confirmation of contents in the first pack. "Sheriff, everything inside appears frozen in time." Reed approached the closest backpack, a blue one decorated with soccer ball patches and a keychain that read, "Diego's Lucky Gloves." Through the mesh side pocket, she could see a juice box with an expiration date of January 15th, 2011. The main compartment held what appeared to be a child's carefully packed lunch, sandwiches wrapped in aluminum foil, an apple that should have rotted to nothing years ago, and a thermos with cartoon characters she recognized from her own childhood. Every single pack contains homework dated December 14th, 2010, Martinez continued, consulting his notes. Math worksheets, reading assignments, permission slips for the Christmas party scheduled for that Friday. It's like someone froze a moment in time and buried it in the glacier. Reed examined each backpack in turn, noting the distinct personalities reflected in their contents. Purple Disney princesses, superhero logos, nature guidebooks, art supplies. 7 different children with 7 different dreams, all reduced to artifacts in an evidence locker. The technical impossibility gnawed at her. 15 Colorado winters should have reduced these items to fragments and decay, even accounting for glacial preservation. Instead, she was documenting a perfect time capsule that challenged everything she understood about forensic science. Her radio crackled with updates from the valley below. The first news van had arrived in Clearwater, and reporters were already knocking on doors in the neighborhoods where the missing children had lived. Parents who had spent 15 years learning to function around a hole in their hearts would soon face cameras and microphones, forced to relive their worst nightmare for public consumption. Reed stared at the 7 backpacks and realized that finding them might prove more devastating than losing them had been. The families had built their lives around uncertainty, clinging to hope while accepting the probability of death. Now they would demand answers she didn't have, closure she couldn't provide, and justice for a crime she wasn't even sure had been committed. The glacier continued its ancient retreat, indifferent to the chaos it had unleashed on the living. Bus driver Len Wallace adjusted his rearview mirror and watched 7 children climb aboard Bus 12 on the morning that would define the rest of his life. December 14, 2010, had started like any other Monday in Clearwater County. Wallace, a semi-retired Vietnam veteran who took substitute driving shifts to supplement his mechanic pension, arrived at the depot 45 minutes early as always. The regular driver had called in sick with flu symptoms, leaving Wallace to navigate an unfamiliar route through the mountain subdivisions. The children boarded with the casual energy of kids looking forward to their last week before Christmas break. 10-year-old Jonah Ellis carried his plastic telescope, scanning the pre-dawn sky for Venus as he settled into the front seat. Behind him, Chloe Nguyen quietly arranged her new watercolor set, an early Christmas gift from grandparents who wanted to encourage her artistic talents. Wallace checked each name against his roster, making eye contact with every child as district policy required. Savannah Price clutched a veterinary journal she had borrowed from the library, already dreaming of the animal clinic she would open someday. Diego Martinez bounced his lucky soccer ball against the window, counting the days until Saturday's championship game. The morning felt routine until Wallace noticed the weather changing as they climbed toward Elk Pass Elementary. What had started as light snow was intensifying rapidly, and his radio crackled with increasingly urgent weather updates. Mountain roads were becoming treacherous ahead of schedule. Caleb Brown organized his Lego pieces in careful rows across his seat, building structures that defied gravity and physics. Emily Thompson worked through math problems that challenged students 3 grades ahead of her level. Malachi Rivers pressed his nose against the frosted window, identifying bird species despite the deteriorating visibility. Wallace made the decision that would haunt him forever when dispatch offered him the option to turn Buac. The children were chattering about their upcoming Christmas party, excited about cookies and presents waiting at school. He thought about disappointed parents scrambling for childcare and teachers preparing lessons for empty classrooms. 7 children trusted him to deliver them safely to their Monday morning classes, and Wallace believed he could navigate any mountain storm with 25 years of driving experience behind him. The last radio transmission from Bus 12 came at 7:32 a.m., Wallace reporting decreased visibility, but maintaining his route toward the school. By 8:15 a.m., when the bus failed to arrive for morning roll call, 7 empty desks marked the beginning of Clearwater County's most devastating mystery. The Ellis family kitchen still smelled like pancakes and coffee when the phone call came that would divide their lives into before and after. Jonah Ellis had bounded down the stairs that morning with his plastic telescope clutched against his chest, chattering about the astronomy unit his 4th grade class was studying. His mother, Denise, remembered pouring orange juice and reminding him to zip his jacket, ordinary moments that became precious when they turned out to be the last. At 10 years old, Jonah possessed an insatiable curiosity about the universe that embarrassed and delighted his parents in equal measure. He asked questions that stumped adults, built rocket models with engineering precision, and fell asleep each night with star charts scattered across his bedroom floor. The telescope was a birthday gift he carried everywhere, convinced that the next amazing discovery was always just one observation away. 3 miles across town, Chloe Nguyen carefully packed her new watercolor set in her backpack, arranging the brushes and tubes with the methodical precision of a serious artist. Her grandmother had driven 2 hours from Denver to deliver the early Christmas gift, recognizing talent that needed nurturing rather than waiting for holiday traditions. Chloe painted the world as she wished it could be, filling sketchbooks with landscapes where flowers bloomed in impossible colors and animals lived in harmony with humans. Her art teacher displayed her work in the front hallway, where visitors consistently mistook it for pieces created by much older students. The Nguyen family had immigrated from Vietnam when Chloe was 6, building a new life around their daughter's quiet brilliance and their determination to provide opportunities they had never imagined for themselves. Savannah Price finished her breakfast while reading about veterinary procedures that most adults would find disturbing, her fascination with animal medicine overriding any squeamishness about blood and surgery. Her bedroom was filled with injured birds and abandoned kittens that she nursed back to health, transforming her space into an unofficial wildlife rehabilitation center. Her parents supported her unusual hobby with a combination of pride and exasperation, frequently finding themselves rushing to emergency veterinary clinics with creatures Savannah had rescued from roadside ditches and school playgrounds. Diego Martinez bounced his lucky soccer ball against the garage door while waiting for the bus, practicing the footwork that had made him the youngest goalkeeper in the county league's history. His father owned the local auto shop, and Diego spent afternoons there learning to repair engines when he wasn't defending goals with reflexes that seemed almost supernatural. The Martinez family had built their identity around Diego's athletic potential, already discussing college scholarships and professional possibilities that seemed within reach for a 10-year-old with such natural talent. 7 families sent their children to school that morning with the casual confidence of parents who believed the universe was fundamentally safe, that school buses arrived on time, and children came home with stories about their day. By noon, they would learn how wrong that assumption could be. The storm moved across Elk Pass with the sudden violence of a mountain weather system that meteorologists would later classify as unprecedented for December. Karen Price watched through her kitchen window as snow began falling with increasing intensity, thinking about her daughter Savannah's thin jacket and hoping the school would make the right decision about early dismissal. The weather forecast had predicted light snow, not the whirling white wall that was rapidly obscuring the mountain landscape. 15 miles away, Bus 12 climbed the winding road toward Elk Pass Elementary as visibility dropped from manageable to dangerous in a matter of minutes. Len Wallace gripped the steering wheel with both hands, feeling the vehicle slip slightly on curves that he had navigated without difficulty just days earlier. His radio crackled with updates from dispatch, reports of rapidly deteriorating conditions across the mountain district. 3 other buses had already turned back, but Wallace was closest to the school and carrying only 7 children instead of his usual capacity of 30. The decision seemed logical. Push forward the final 2 miles rather than attempt a dangerous U-turn on increasingly icy pavement. Behind him, the children pressed against windows that were becoming opaque with snow accumulation. Jonah Ellis used his sleeve to wipe condensation from the glass, trying to glimpse the sky through the storm, while Chloe Nguyen sketched the abstract patterns that snowflakes created against the windows. Emily Thompson worked through her math homework with fierce concentration, solving problems that would challenge high school students, while Caleb Brown built increasingly complex Lego structures that defied the bus's swaying motion. Diego Martinez had stopped bouncing his soccer ball, finally recognizing that something was different about this Monday morning ride. Wallace's last radio transmission came at 7:36 a.m., his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Dispatch, Bus 12 approaching mile marker 15. Visibility down to maybe 20 feet. Proceeding with caution to Elk Pass Elementary." The response crackled back through increasing static. "Copy that, Bus 12. Weather Service upgrading to blizzard warning. Advise immediate shelter if conditions worsen." Parents across Clearwater County received the first automated calls about weather-related delays at 8:10 a.m. Cheerful recorded messages suggesting that pickup times might be adjusted due to unexpected storm conditions. The calls carried no hint of urgency, no suggestion that anything more serious than scheduling inconvenience was developing in the mountains. Denise Ellis set her coffee aside and called the school directly, a maternal instinct warning her that something felt wrong about the morning's timing. The busy signal she received would become a sound that haunted her dreams, the electronic tone that marked the moment when normal parental worry transformed into life-altering panic. By 8:30 a.m., when Bus 12 failed to arrive at Elk Pass Elementary, 7 families were about to discover that storms could steal more than just time from a Monday morning schedule. Sheriff Robert Hayes stood at mile marker 15, watching his deputies follow tire tracks that disappeared into a wall of blowing snow, knowing that every passing minute reduced the chances of finding 7 children alive. The call had come in at 8:45 a.m. when Elk Pass Elementary reported Bus 12 as missing, 45 minutes overdue, with no radio contact since Wallace's final transmission. Hayes had immediately dispatched 3 patrol cars to trace the bus route, but the storm was erasing evidence as quickly as his officers could document it. Deputy Rachel Torres knelt beside the clearest tire impressions, photographing tread marks that showed Bus 12 had been traveling at reduced speed when it passed this point. The tracks suggested controlled driving rather than panic, but they ended abruptly where the wind had scoured the pavement clean. Hayes coordinated search efforts through his radio while privately calculating the grim mathematics of mountain survival. December temperatures in Elk Pass could drop to 20 below zero after sunset, and 7 children dressed for a normal school day would not survive a night in the wilderness without shelter. The Colorado State Patrol helicopter lifted off from Grand Junction at 9:30 a.m., racing against weather conditions that threatened to ground all aircraft by noon. Pilot Maria Santos had flown rescue missions across the Rockies for 8 years, but she had never searched for missing children in weather this severe. From 200 feet above the terrain, Santos could see the bus route stretching toward the glacier like a thin ribbon connecting civilization to wilderness. The storm had transformed familiar landmarks into an alien landscape, where roads, rivers, and ridgelines blended into indistinct white shapes. Her thermal imaging equipment detected several large objects moving through the forest, but closer inspection revealed elk and deer seeking shelter rather than human survivors. The helicopter's searchlight swept across miles of empty terrain, finding nothing that resembled a yellow school bus or evidence of 7 missing children. Ground teams followed snowshoe tracks and established checkpoints at every access road, but the storm was winning the race against their search efforts. Hayes watched his officers disappear into the blizzard and wondered if he was about to lose more lives trying to save 7 children who might already be beyond help. At 2:15 p.m., tracking dogs arrived from the Denver K-9 unit, German shepherds trained to locate human scent even in extreme weather conditions. Their handlers released them at mile marker 15, hoping that canine instincts could succeed where human technology was failing. The dogs circled the area where Bus 12's tire tracks ended, whining and pawing at the snow-covered asphalt. After 15 minutes of confusion, they began moving toward the tree line with sudden purpose, following a scent trail that led directly toward Elk Glacier. Hayes followed the dogs into the wilderness, praying that their destination would be a shelter where 7 children were waiting for rescue rather than a crash site where hope would die in the gathering darkness. The emergency meeting at Clearwater Town Hall erupted into chaos as parents, officials, and volunteers struggled to reconcile conflicting theories about what had happened to Bus 12. Mayor Patricia Hendricks called for order as voices rose throughout the packed auditorium, but rational discussion had become impossible when 7 families were facing every parent's worst nightmare. The meeting had been scheduled to coordinate search efforts, but instead became a forum for accusations, conspiracy theories, and desperate attempts to find someone to blame. Denise Ellis stood at the microphone demanding answers that nobody could provide. The dogs followed a trail toward the glacier, but then they lost the scent completely. How does a school bus just disappear in 2 miles of open road? Her question hung in the air like an accusation, challenging the assembled officials to explain the inexplicable. Sheriff Hayes tried to project calm authority, while privately acknowledging that his department was facing a case unlike anything in Colorado history. Dr. Robert Sterling, a child psychologist who specialized in trauma counseling, attempted to redirect the discussion toward practical matters. Our priority must be continuing the search while weather permits. Speculation about causes won't help us find 7 missing children. His reasonable tone was drowned out by Hector Martinez, whose son Diego had been carrying his lucky goalkeeper gloves when Bus 12 disappeared. You want us to stay calm while our kids are freezing to death somewhere in those mountains? The school district knew this storm was coming. Why wasn't the bus route canceled? Superintendent Linda Walsh defended her staff's decisions while acknowledging that weather forecasts had underestimated the storm's severity. Our drivers are trained professionals who make judgment calls based on real-time conditions. Len Wallace has 25 years of experience driving mountain routes. The mention of Wallace's name triggered another wave of arguments as parents divided into camps that either trusted his expertise or blamed his judgment for their children's disappearance. Some families insisted that an experienced driver would never risk children's lives in dangerous weather, while others questioned why he hadn't turned back when visibility deteriorated. Karen Price approached the microphone with evidence that silenced the room, a printout of weather service warnings that had been issued 90 minutes before Bus 12's departure. The National Weather Service predicted blizzard conditions by 8 a.m. Why were any buses running routes through mountain passes? Her documentation created an uncomfortable silence as officials realized that decision-making failures might have contributed to the tragedy. The gap between weather predictions and school district policies would become a central focus of investigations that were already beginning behind closed doors. FBI agent Michael Torres introduced himself to the assembly and confirmed that federal resources were being deployed to support local search efforts. Missing children cases receive our highest priority, regardless of the circumstances that caused their disappearance. His presence both reassured and alarmed the families, who understood that FBI involvement suggested possibilities more sinister than weather-related accidents. Torres's careful phrasing left room for interpretations that ranged from mechanical failure to criminal abduction, expanding the scope of possibilities that parents were forced to consider. The meeting ended without resolution as search teams prepared for another night of looking for 7 children who had vanished without leaving evidence of their fate. The official search for Bus 12 ended on June 15, 2011, when Sheriff Hayes signed the paperwork that transferred case file 10B07 from active investigation to the state archives. 6 months of intensive searching had yielded nothing more substantial than tire tracks and conflicting witness statements. Helicopter flights, ground teams, tracking dogs, thermal imaging, and volunteer searches involving hundreds of community members had covered every accessible square mile of Elk Pass wilderness without finding trace evidence of 7 children or their missing school bus. The decision to suspend active search operations felt like a betrayal to the families, but Hayes could no longer justify the resources required to continue looking for survivors who had almost certainly perished in the December storm. His department had spent its entire annual budget on search efforts while neglecting routine law enforcement duties across Clearwater County. Federal involvement had lasted 3 months before FBI resources were redirected to cases with actionable leads and evidence of potential resolution. Agent Torres delivered the news with professional compassion, but his message was clear. Without new developments, the Bureau could not maintain indefinite commitment to a search that showed no promise of success. The families organized private search parties that continued through the spring and summer, weekend expeditions led by experienced hikers who donated time and expertise to keep hope alive. These volunteer efforts covered terrain that official searches had missed, checking caves, ravines, and abandoned mining structures where survivors might have sought shelter. Denise Ellis led many of these expeditions, carrying Jonah's photograph in her backpack and stopping at every overlook to scan the wilderness through binoculars. The methodical searching gave her purpose and the illusion of control over circumstances that had proven completely beyond anyone's influence. Hector Martinez organized annual memorial hikes that drew participants from across Colorado, turning the search for his son Diego into a broader mission of supporting families who had lost children to mountain tragedies. The hikes raised funds for search and rescue operations while keeping public attention focused on the unsolved case. Local media coverage gradually diminished as other stories claimed headlines, and the mystery of Bus 12 became part of Clearwater County's folklore rather than its daily reality. The case joined the collection of unsolved disappearances that haunted rural communities throughout the American West, places where wilderness could swallow lives without leaving explanations for the living. Karen Price channeled her grief into legal action, filing wrongful death lawsuits against the school district and demanding policy changes that would prevent similar tragedies. Her litigation efforts kept the case in public consciousness while forcing institutional accountability for decisions made on December 14, 2010. The archived case file contained thousands of pages of reports, witness statements, photographs, and evidence logs that documented the most comprehensive search operation in Colorado history. Somewhere in those documents lay clues that might eventually solve the mystery, but not until 15 years later, when melting ice would reveal secrets that the mountain had been keeping. Sheriff Hayes retired in disgrace 2 years later, his career destroyed by his failure to find 7 missing children who had vanished under his watch. Dr. Ingrid Schultz stared at the laboratory report that challenged everything she understood about glacial preservation and forensic science. The University of Colorado's cryogenic analysis facility had spent 3 weeks examining fabric samples from the 7 backpacks, subjecting them to carbon dating, microscopic analysis, and chemical composition tests. The results defied rational explanation while confirming what her eyes had already told her at the glacier site. The backpacks had been preserved in a near-perfect anaerobic environment for 15 years, locked inside an ice cavity that had maintained constant sub-zero temperatures without the freeze-thaw cycles that typically destroyed organic materials. The glacier had functioned as a natural time capsule, protecting evidence with scientific precision. But the preservation was too complete, too systematic to result from random chance. Schultz examined photographic documentation of the backpack's positioning, noting how they had been scattered across the ice in a pattern that suggested deliberate placement rather than chaotic dumping. Her phone buzzed with a call from Sheriff Reed, who was coordinating the expanded investigation from her office in town. "Dr. Schultz, I need your professional opinion about something the lab techs found inside the backpacks." The sheriff's voice carried a tension that made Schultz's stomach clench with anticipation of another impossible discovery. She had agreed to consult on the case because glacial science was her expertise. But each new revelation pushed the evidence further beyond natural explanation. Every lunch item was individually wrapped in plastic bags, Reed continued. Not the way kids normally pack their food, but like someone was preparing materials for long-term storage. Even the fruit was vacuum sealed. Schultz closed her eyes and tried to reconcile this information with her understanding of how 7 children had vanished from a school bus. The methodical preservation suggested planning and intention rather than the chaos of an accident or abduction. The laboratory report included one final detail that would haunt Schultz for weeks afterward. Microscopic analysis had detected traces of volcanic glass embedded in the fabric fibers, ancient material that originated from geological layers deep beneath the glacier's surface. The backpacks had somehow traveled through time and space in ways that challenged both physics and logic, carrying evidence of a journey that no living person could explain. Oliver Kent stared at his laptop screen displaying a photograph he had dismissed as meaningless for 13 years, now realizing it might hold the key to solving Colorado's most infamous missing persons case. The image had been captured during a solo backpacking trip in August 2012, part of Kent's obsessive documentation of wilderness experiences that he shared with his modest social media following. He remembered taking hundreds of photos that week, cataloging landscapes and wildlife with the enthusiasm of someone who had recently discovered mountain photography. The photograph showed Elk Glacier from a vantage point 3 miles downslope from where the backpacks had been discovered, a scenic vista that Kent had hiked to during perfect weather conditions. Hidden in the lower right corner of the frame, barely visible against the white ice, was a faint yellow shape that he had never noticed during years of casual review. Sheriff Reed had contacted him after discovering his online photo galleries, asking him to examine any images from the Elk Pass area between 2010 and 2015. Kent had initially dismissed the request, assuming that his amateur photography could not contribute meaningfully to a professional investigation. But computer enhancement technology had advanced significantly since 2012, and the forensic imaging specialists at the Colorado Bureau of Investigation could extract details from digital files that were invisible to the naked eye. The yellow shape resolved into geometric patterns consistent with painted metal surfaces. Kent felt sick as he realized the implications of his delayed reporting. If he had noticed the anomaly in 2012 and contacted authorities, the investigation might have taken a completely different direction, while evidence was still fresh and witnesses were available. The photograph's metadata confirmed its authenticity while providing precise GPS coordinates and timestamp information that placed the yellow object exactly where glacial flow models predicted Bus 12 would have traveled after entering the ice field. Kent had unknowingly documented proof of the bus's location just 20 months after the disappearance. His guilt was compounded by the recognition that social media fame had become more important to him than civic responsibility. He had been focused on building his online presence and attracting followers rather than carefully examining his own content for evidence that might help grieving families. The enhanced image showed additional details that made Kent's stomach churn with regret. Dark rectangular shapes were visible through what appeared to be broken windows, suggesting that the bus's interior had been accessible to wildlife and weather for years before becoming completely buried in glacial ice. Sheriff Reed scheduled him for a formal interview the following morning, but Kent already knew that his testimony would raise more questions than it answered about why a school bus had ended up embedded in a glacier. The satellite LiDAR pulse penetrated 9 meters of glacial ice before striking something that should not have existed in nature's frozen archive. Dr. Marcus Webb adjusted his ground-penetrating radar equipment and confirmed what the orbital survey had detected from 200 miles above the Earth's surface. A large metallic object lay buried beneath the meltwater channel at Elk Glacier's terminus, its dimensions consistent with a standard school bus. Webb had flown in from the National Center for Atmospheric Research, specifically to analyze the subsurface anomaly that Sheriff Reed's investigation had discovered through technological resources unavailable 15 years earlier. His equipment could map buried objects with precision that surpassed anything available during the original search operation. The LiDAR data revealed an object measuring approximately 35 feet in length and 8 feet in width, positioned at an angle that suggested it had tumbled rather than being deliberately placed. Webb's preliminary assessment indicated that the object had been completely buried for at least a decade, protected from surface detection by layers of accumulated ice and debris. Sheriff Reed stood beside him, watching readouts that transformed her cold case into an active recovery operation. How long would it take to reach that depth with excavation equipment? Webb studied the geological surveys and weather forecasts before responding. Under optimal conditions, maybe 72 hours of continuous digging, but we're racing against spring melt that could shift the entire debris field. The technical challenge was complicated by the glacier's unstable condition following the record warm weather that had exposed the backpacks. Additional ice calving events could bury the target deeper or potentially damage it beyond recognition if heavy equipment was used carelessly. Webb's sonar imaging detected hollow spaces within the buried object, suggesting that the bus's interior had not been completely crushed by glacial pressure. The possibility that human remains might be preserved inside added urgency to the recovery operation, while raising ethical questions about disturbing what had become an inadvertent tomb. His equipment also registered smaller metallic objects scattered around the primary target, debris that had been separated from the main structure during its journey through the glacier. Webb mapped each anomaly with GPS precision, creating a three-dimensional model of the burial site that would guide the excavation effort. The data painted a picture of violent forces that had torn Bus 12 apart while somehow preserving its essential structure. Webb had studied glacial transport mechanics for 20 years, but this case challenged his understanding of how ice could simultaneously destroy and protect the same object. Sheriff Reed authorized the excavation to begin at dawn, knowing that she was about to uncover evidence that would either solve the mystery of 7 missing children or deepen it beyond all comprehension. The laboratory analysis of microscopic debris from the backpack site revealed geological evidence that transformed the investigation from a missing persons case into a scientific mystery. Dr. Elizabeth Santos, the state's leading forensic geologist, examined volcanic glass fragments under high-powered magnification while trying to reconcile her findings with the known geological history of Elk Pass. The obsidian-like material was millions of years old, originating from volcanic activity that had ceased long before human civilization reached Colorado. The glass shards were embedded in fabric fibers and leather straps from multiple backpacks, suggesting that the children's belongings had been exposed to ancient geological layers that should have been inaccessible from the glacier's surface. Santos had never encountered evidence of such deep subsurface contact in a missing persons investigation. Sheriff Reed studied the geological survey map spread across Santos's laboratory table, trying to understand how 7 children's backpacks had acquired volcanic glass from prehistoric rock formations. The evidence suggested a journey through the Earth itself, rather than simple transportation across its surface. This material comes from magma chambers that formed during the Oligocene epoch, Santos explained, while pointing to cross-sectional diagrams of the mountain's internal structure. We're talking about geological layers that exist thousands of feet below the current glacier. The scientific impossibility created new theories about what had happened to Bus 12 and its 7 passengers. Santos theorized that a catastrophic geological event, possibly triggered by seismic activity, had opened temporary fissures that allowed surface objects to penetrate deep into the mountain's interior. but seismographic records from December 2010 showed no evidence of earthquake activity in the Elk Pass region during the time period when Bus 12 had disappeared. The children and their belongings had somehow accessed ancient geological layers without the dramatic earth movements that such contact would typically require. Santos collected additional samples from the backpack site, hoping to trace the path that had carried 7 children from a mountain road into contact with prehistoric volcanic formations. Her analysis revealed a mixture of geological material spanning millions of years of Earth history. The volcanic glass was accompanied by traces of copper ore, silver deposits, and rare earth minerals that existed only in the deepest geological layers beneath Elk Glacier. The backpacks had become inadvertent geological surveys, documenting a subsurface journey that challenged understanding of both physics and geology. Sheriff Reed realized that solving the mystery of 7 missing children would require expertise far beyond traditional law enforcement capabilities. The case was expanding into territories where criminal investigation intersected with earth science in ways that had never been documented before. The volcanic glass shards suggested that Bus 12's disappearance involved forces more ancient and powerful than weather, mechanical failure, or human malice. Detective Malcolm Crowe opened the dusty case file that had haunted his dreams since retirement, knowing that his return to active duty would either vindicate 15 years of persistent doubt or confirm his reputation as an obsessive investigator who could not accept failure. Sheriff Reed had contacted him personally, acknowledging that the backpack discovery and subsequent evidence required expertise that exceeded her department's capabilities. Crowe's legendary persistence with cold cases had made him the obvious choice to lead Task Force Blue Ember, despite his official retirement status and his personal history with unsolved missing persons investigations. The task force conference room in the county courthouse had been transformed into a command center featuring geological surveys, glacial flow models, forensic reports, and timeline reconstructions that covered every available wall surface. 7 photographs of missing children anchored the center of the display, reminding everyone that scientific mysteries could not overshadow human tragedy. Crowe studied the evidence with methodical precision that had characterized his 25-year career with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. His reputation for solving impossible cases had been built on the recognition that overlooked details often contained the keys to breakthrough discoveries. His personal motivation ran deeper than professional obligation. Crowe had lost his own son in a hiking accident 12 years earlier, and the experience had taught him that families needed definitive answers rather than comfortable theories about what might have happened to their missing loved ones. "We're dealing with evidence that challenges conventional investigation methods," Crowe told the assembled task force members during their first official meeting. "But 7 children deserve the same commitment to truth that we would provide in any other case." The task force included specialists from multiple disciplines: glaciologists, forensic anthropologists, search and rescue coordinators, and criminal investigators who brought diverse expertise to a case that had expanded beyond traditional law enforcement boundaries. Crowe coordinated their efforts while maintaining focus on the central mission of determining what had happened to 7 missing children. His first decision was to re-interview every surviving witness from the original investigation, recognizing that 15 years of reflection might have produced new insights or recovered memories that had been suppressed by trauma. The methodical approach would be time-consuming, but essential for building a complete understanding of December 14, 2010. Crowe also authorized the excavation of Bus 12's burial site, despite the technical challenges and expense involved in recovering evidence from beneath 9 meters of glacial ice. The decision reflected his belief that physical evidence would ultimately prove more reliable than witness testimony or theoretical reconstruction. The task force faced a deadline imposed by climate change itself, as rising temperatures threatened to shift the glacier's remaining structure and potentially destroy evidence that had been preserved for 15 years. The missing evidence bag from the original 2011 investigation cast doubt on the integrity of every piece of physical evidence that Task Force Blue Ember had collected from the glacier site. Evidence custodian Janet Morrison discovered the gap while conducting the comprehensive inventory that Detective Crow had ordered as his first official act upon returning to active duty. Item 10B070847 was listed in the chain of custody logs, but missing from the secure storage facility where it should have resided for the past 14 years. The missing bag had contained soil samples collected from mile marker 15, the location where Bus 12's tire tracks had been last documented before disappearing into the December 2010 blizzard. Morrison's records showed that the evidence had been properly logged and stored according to departmental protocols. Sheriff Reed convened an emergency meeting to assess the implications of the chain of custody breach, knowing that defense attorneys could use the missing evidence to challenge any criminal charges that might eventually result from the investigation. The gap also raised questions about whether other evidence had been mishandled or deliberately removed. Detective Crow examined the storage facility's security logs and discovered that access to the evidence room had been limited to authorized personnel throughout the 14-year period. The missing bag had not been stolen by external intruders, but had disappeared through internal failure or deliberate removal by someone with legitimate access. The timing of the discovery was particularly problematic because media attention had intensified following the backpack revelation, and public confidence in the investigation's integrity was essential for maintaining community support. Crow worried that evidence tampering allegations would overshadow legitimate scientific discoveries. Morrison provided detailed testimony about evidence handling procedures, while acknowledging that the original investigation had been conducted under extreme pressure with limited resources. Some documentation gaps were inevitable when 7 children were missing, and every hour of delay potentially meant the difference between rescue and recovery. The missing soil samples were routine environmental evidence, Morrison explained during her interview with the task force. At the time, we were focused on finding living children rather than preserving material for future analysis. But Crow recognized that routine evidence often proved crucial years later when investigations took unexpected directions. The missing soil samples might have contained geological or chemical clues that could have accelerated the current investigation or provided independent confirmation of other findings. The chain of custody breach forced the task force to question every piece of evidence while proceeding with the assumption that additional materials might have been compromised or removed. Crow implemented new security protocols while privately wondering whether someone had deliberately sabotaged the investigation. The missing evidence bag represented either bureaucratic incompetence or active obstruction, and determining which possibility was accurate would require investigating the investigators who had worked the original case. The industrial drilling rig arrived at Elk Glacier before dawn, on a morning when temperatures hovered just above freezing, creating optimal conditions for the most ambitious evidence recovery operation in Colorado history. Engineering contractor Luis Mendoza supervised the equipment placement while coordinating with glaciologists who were monitoring ice stability in real time using seismic sensors positioned around the drilling site. The massive diesel-powered drill had been transported to the glacier on specialized vehicles, capable of traversing terrain that challenged even military equipment. Detective Crow watched the operation from a command tent that had been established at safe distance from the drilling location, knowing that the next 72 hours would either confirm or destroy 15 years of theories about what had happened to Bus 12. The excavation represented a point of no return for the investigation. Dr. Ingrid Schultz provided continuous consultation about glacial conditions, while warning that warm weather could destabilize the ice field and potentially bury the target deeper or shift it beyond the drill's reach. The operation required precise coordination between multiple teams working in dangerous conditions. The drill penetrated the first 3 meters of ice within 6 hours, revealing layers that documented 15 years of glacial accumulation through variations in color, density, and embedded debris. Schultz collected core samples that would provide detailed climate data spanning the entire period since Bus 12's disappearance. At 9 meters depth, the drill bit encountered resistance that confirmed the presence of a large metallic object. Mendoza adjusted his equipment settings to avoid damaging what lay beneath, while continuing the excavation with surgical precision that belied the industrial scale of the operation. Yellow paint chips appeared in the drill cuttings at 9.3 meters depth, providing the first visual confirmation that the buried object was indeed the missing school bus. The discovery sent waves of excitement and apprehension through the assembled teams, who understood that they were about to disturb what had become a tomb. The drilling operation proceeded around the clock, as specialists worked in rotating shifts to maintain continuous progress, while weather conditions remained favorable. Portable floodlights transformed the glacier into a surreal industrial landscape, where modern technology intersected with ancient ice. By hour 60, excavation had revealed the bus's roof and upper windows, confirming that the vehicle had landed upside down after its journey through the glacier. The positioning suggested violent tumbling rather than controlled descent, raising new questions about the forces that had transported Bus 12 from road to burial site. Detective Crow prepared for the moment when human remains would be discovered inside the excavated vehicle, knowing that 7 families were about to receive the closure they had sought for 15 years. The robotic camera descended through the shaft that had been carved into Elk Glacier, transmitting images that would finally reveal what had happened inside Bus 12 during the last moments before 7 children vanished from the world. Detective Crow watched the monitors as the remotely operated vehicle maneuvered through the excavated tunnel, its LED lights illuminating ice walls that sparkled like crystal formations in an underground cave. The technology allowed investigation of the burial site without risking human lives in the unstable environment 9 meters below the surface. The camera reached Bus 12's interior through a window that had been shattered during the vehicle's tumultuous journey into the glacier. Crow expected to see the horrific aftermath of a deadly accident, but the first images transmitted from inside the bus defied every assumption about what had occurred on December 14, 2010. The seats were empty. 7 child-sized impressions remained in the upholstery where bodies had once sat, surrounded by school supplies, lunch boxes, and personal belongings that had been scattered by the bus's violent tumble. But no human remains were visible in the initial camera sweep of the passenger compartment. Sheriff Reed studied the monitor displays while trying to process evidence that challenged the fundamental premise of their investigation. Where are the children? The robotic vehicle continued its methodical documentation, revealing additional details that deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. Emergency exits had been forced open from the inside, suggesting that the passengers had evacuated the bus after it became buried in the glacier. Driver Len Wallace's body was discovered in the driver's seat, preserved by the same ice that had protected the backpacks found weeks earlier. Medical examination would be required to determine cause of death, but preliminary visual assessment suggested that Wallace had died from injuries sustained during the crash rather than exposure or asphyxiation. The bus's dashboard clock had stopped at 7:36 a.m., exactly 4 minutes after Wallace's final radio transmission and 12 minutes before the vehicle should have arrived at Elk Pass Elementary. The timeline confirmed that Bus 12 had encountered disaster almost immediately after losing radio contact. But the preserved scene inside the bus raised more questions than it answered. 7 children had somehow survived the initial crash, evacuated through emergency exits, and then disappeared into a glacial environment where survival should have been impossible for minutes rather than the hours or days that evacuation would have required. The robotic camera discovered a crack in the bus floor that led into what appeared to be a natural cave system beneath the glacier. The opening was large enough for children to crawl through, but too small for adult investigation without specialized equipment. Detective Crow realized that finding Bus 12 had been only the beginning of a mystery that extended far beyond a simple transportation accident. The absence of 7 bodies inside Bus 12 transformed the investigation from a recovery operation into the most complex missing persons case in Colorado history. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Patricia Valdez descended into the excavation shaft to conduct first-hand examination of evidence that had been preserved in pristine condition for 15 years. Her expertise in analyzing remains and trauma patterns would be essential for understanding what had happened during Bus 12's final minutes above ground. The bus interior resembled a museum exhibit documenting December 2010, with newspapers, homework assignments, and children's belongings frozen in positions that showed the violence of the vehicle's tumbling descent into the glacier. Valdez photographed every detail while noting the absence of blood, tissue, or other biological evidence that would typically mark the site of traumatic deaths. The emergency exits had been opened from inside the bus, confirming that passengers had survived the initial crash and possessed enough consciousness and mobility to attempt escape. Valdez found small handprints on the exit mechanisms, evidence that children, rather than adult supervision, had initiated the evacuation. The positioning of personal belongings suggests that the passengers were thrown around violently during the crash, Valdez reported to Detective Crow via radio communication. But there's no evidence of fatal trauma inside the vehicle. The discovery challenged every assumption about school bus safety and survival in extreme conditions. 7 children had somehow lived through a crash severe enough to bury their vehicle under tons of glacial ice, then successfully evacuated into an environment where survival seemed impossible. Valdez examined the floor crack that led into the subsurface cave system, noting tool marks that suggested deliberate enlargement rather than natural formation. Someone or something had widened the opening to allow easier passage, though the identity of who had done the work remained unclear. The cave system extended beyond the reach of her preliminary investigation, disappearing into darkness that her headlamp could not penetrate. Fresh air currents suggested that the tunnels connected to other openings, possibly providing an escape route that explained how 7 children had survived evacuation from their buried bus. Driver Len Wallace's body showed injuries consistent with blunt force trauma sustained during the crash, but Valdez noted that his injuries would not have been immediately fatal. Wallace had lived for some time after the bus came to rest, possibly long enough to assist with passenger evacuation before succumbing to his injuries. The forensic evidence painted a picture of organized evacuation rather than panic, suggesting that someone had taken charge of the situation and led 7 children to safety through the cave system. But 15 years later, none of those children had returned to claim their survival or reunion with families who had mourned them as dead. Detective Crow faced the impossible task of explaining how 7 children had vanished twice, first from their school bus and then from a glacier where they should never have been able to survive. The ice core analysis revealed that Bus 12 had traveled through Elk Glacier like a passenger aboard a frozen river, moving 3 miles from its entry point to its final burial location over the course of 15 years. Dr. Ingrid Schultz presented her findings to Task Force Blue Ember using computer models that tracked glacial flow patterns with scientific precision unavailable during the original investigation. The bus had followed predictable paths governed by gravity, ice density and underlying terrain features that channeled debris toward the glacier's terminus. Glacial transport is essentially a conveyor belt system, Schultz explained, while displaying three-dimensional animations of ice movement. Objects that enter the glacier at high elevation gradually migrate downslope, carried by ice that moves approximately 6 inches per year. The scientific explanation resolved the geographical mystery of how a school bus had traveled from mile marker 15 to the backpack discovery site, but it raised new questions about the timeline of events on December 14, 2010. Bus 12 had somehow entered the glacier system within minutes of Wallace's final radio transmission. Detective Crow studied geological surveys that mapped the terrain between the bus route and the glacier's edge, searching for natural pathways that could have carried a vehicle into the ice field. The land was too steep and rocky for normal vehicle travel, requiring extraordinary circumstances to bridge the gap between road and glacier. Carbon dating of organic materials found inside the bus confirmed that the vehicle had been buried continuously since 2010, eliminating theories about temporary burial and later discovery. The children's belongings had been preserved in the same anaerobic environment that protected archaeological artifacts in permafrost conditions. Schultz's analysis also explained the volcanic glass shards found in the backpacks, revealing that the glacier's movement had carried the children's belongings through geological layers containing ancient mineral deposits. The subsurface journey had inadvertently created a comprehensive geological survey of the mountain's internal structure. But the scientific precision of glacial transport made the children's survival even more mysterious. 7 kids had somehow evacuated from a bus that was already embedded in moving ice, then disappeared into a cave system that should have been inaccessible from the surface. The ice core samples contained additional evidence that challenged understanding of what had occurred beneath the glacier during the 15 years since Bus 12's disappearance. Pollen analysis revealed traces of plants that grew only at much lower elevations, suggesting that air currents from the valley floor had somehow reached the buried cave system. Temperature measurements from the core samples indicated that the cave system had remained above freezing despite being surrounded by glacial ice, creating a microenvironment where human survival might have been theoretically possible for extended periods. Detective Crow realized that Elk Glacier had functioned as both tomb and time capsule, preserving evidence while slowly transporting it toward inevitable discovery by future investigators who possessed technology unavailable in 2010. The GPS analysis of backpack locations revealed a distribution pattern that contradicted every theory about how 7 children had disappeared from their buried school bus. Forensic mapping specialist Jennifer Walsh overlaid satellite imagery with precise coordinates where each backpack had been discovered, creating a 3-dimensional model that showed their positions relative to Bus 12's burial site. The results challenged basic assumptions about physics and human behavior. The backpacks had been scattered across nearly 1 mile of glacier surface, positioned at elevations significantly higher than the bus location, and arranged in a pattern that suggested deliberate placement rather than random distribution. Walsh had never encountered evidence scattered in such an organized manner during accidental deaths. The positioning doesn't match any known dispersal pattern from vehicle accidents or natural disasters, Walsh reported to Detective Crow during the task force briefing. These backpacks were placed individually, possibly over an extended time period. The discovery meant that 7 children had not only survived evacuation from their buried bus, but had also climbed up slope through difficult terrain while carrying their school belongings. The physical demands of such travel would have challenged experienced adult hikers, let alone elementary school students. Each backpack location corresponded to optimal visibility positions, where objects would eventually be exposed by glacial retreat, suggesting that whoever placed them understood long-term ice dynamics and intended for the evidence to be discovered years later. The positioning required scientific knowledge unavailable to 10-year-old children. Detective Crow examined the evidence distribution map while trying to reconcile witness testimony with physical reality. Parents had described their children as normal kids with age-appropriate capabilities, not wilderness survival experts capable of navigating glacial terrain in winter conditions. The backpack contents had been methodically prepared for long-term preservation, with food items vacuum-sealed and documents protected in waterproof containers. The preparation level suggested advanced planning rather than emergency improvisation by frightened children. Walsh identified additional evidence markers at locations between the backpack sites and Bus 12's burial position, small objects that had been deliberately placed to create a trail connecting the scattered evidence. The markers included personal items that confirmed the children's presence at multiple locations over an extended time period. Someone wanted these backpacks to be found, Walsh concluded, while highlighting the systematic nature of the evidence distribution. This wasn't random loss during a survival situation. The forensic mapping revealed that 7 children had somehow gained knowledge and capabilities far beyond their documented ages and experience levels, then used those abilities to create an evidence trail that would eventually lead investigators to their missing school bus. Detective Crow faced the possibility that the case involved factors beyond conventional criminal investigation, circumstances that might never be fully understood or explained to the families who had waited 15 years for answers. The dashboard clock, frozen at 7:36 a.m., created a timeline impossibility that threatened to unravel every theory about Bus 12's disappearance. Detective Crow stared at the digital display preserved in ice, knowing that the timestamp contradicted fundamental evidence that had anchored the investigation for 15 years. According to traffic cameras, Bus 12 had passed mile marker 12 at 7:32 a.m., beginning the final 4-mile stretch toward Elk Pass Elementary. The frozen clock suggested that Bus 12 had crashed just 4 minutes after passing the last camera checkpoint, but search teams in 2010 had found no evidence of accident or mechanical failure along that entire route. The timing compressed the window for disaster to an impossibly narrow margin. Sheriff Reed reviewed traffic camera footage that had been analyzed repeatedly during the original investigation, confirming that Bus 12 appeared normal and under control at 7:32 a.m. Driver Len Wallace showed no signs of distress. The vehicle maintained proper speed and lane position, and visibility conditions remained manageable. 4 minutes doesn't provide enough time for the bus to reach the glacier through normal terrain, Reed observed while studying topographical maps that showed the distance between road and ice field. Something extraordinary happened during those 4 minutes. The timeline discrepancy suggested that Bus 12 had somehow traveled from mile marker 12 to glacial burial in less time than should have been physically possible. Detective Crow considered theories involving mechanical failure, sudden weather changes, or geological events that might explain the compressed time frame. Seismographic records from December 14, 2010, showed no earthquake activity during the critical time period, eliminating theories about ground collapse or avalanche conditions that might have carried the bus into the glacier system. Weather station data confirmed that visibility had remained adequate for safe driving until after 8 a.m. The dashboard clock had been frozen by the same ice that preserved everything else inside Bus 12, confirming its accuracy while challenging the laws of physics and geography. 7 children had disappeared into an impossible timeline that defied rational explanation. Dr. Ingrid Schultz provided additional analysis of glacial conditions on December 14, 2010, confirming that the ice field had been stable and inaccessible from the bus route. No natural pathway existed for a vehicle to travel from road to glacier without leaving evidence that search teams would have discovered. The 4-minute window became the central mystery of a case that had already challenged conventional understanding of survival, transportation, and evidence preservation. Detective Crow realized that solving the timeline puzzle might require accepting possibilities that lay beyond traditional investigative methodology. The frozen clock represented either a crucial clue or evidence that the case involved factors that would never be fully understood by rational analysis. The families gathered at Elk Glacier on a clear morning in late May, carrying photographs and flowers to the site where their children's belongings had been discovered after 15 years of uncertain grief. Karen Price led the procession across the uneven ice, clutching a framed school picture of her daughter Savannah that had been taken just weeks before the disappearance. The other parents followed in solemn formation, each carrying mementos that represented lives cut short before their potential could be realized. Detective Crow attended the memorial service in his official capacity, while privately acknowledging that the investigation had raised more questions than it had answered. The families deserved closure, but the evidence suggested mysteries that might never be fully resolved through conventional investigative methods. Sheriff Reed presented the official timeline that her department had reconstructed from forensic evidence, explaining how Bus 12 had crashed during the December 2010 blizzard and been carried through the glacier system over 15 years. The explanation satisfied legal requirements while leaving emotional questions unanswered. "We can confirm that your children survived the initial accident and successfully evacuated from the bus," Reed announced to the assembled families. "The evidence shows that they demonstrated remarkable courage and resourcefulness during their final hours." The memorial service included readings from school essays that the children had written about their dreams and aspirations, documents that had been preserved in their backpacks and recovered from the glacier site. Teachers had saved copies of the assignments, creating a permanent record of 7 young minds that had been lost too soon. Denise Ellis spoke on behalf of all the families, acknowledging that complete answers might never be available, while expressing gratitude for the evidence that had finally been recovered. "We know that Jonah and his friends were brave and stayed together. That knowledge brings us more peace than we had before." The service concluded with the placement of 7 memorial stones at coordinates where each backpack had been discovered, creating permanent markers that would commemorate the children's lives long after the glacier retreated beyond recognition. The stones bore inscriptions celebrating individual personalities and shared courage. Father Miguel Santos offered prayers for the missing children, while acknowledging that faith sometimes required accepting mysteries that surpassed human understanding. The families found comfort in believing that their children had experienced something extraordinary, rather than simply perishing in a transportation accident. The memorial established annual pilgrimages that would bring the community together to remember 7 children who had disappeared into circumstances that challenged conventional explanation, while demonstrating resilience that inspired everyone who learned their story. Detective Malcolm Crow submitted his final report to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, while privately acknowledging that closing Bus 12 as a solved case felt like professional dishonestly. The evidence supported conclusions about accidental death during severe weather conditions, evacuation from the crashed vehicle, and subsequent disappearance into glacial cave systems where survival would have been impossible beyond a few hours. The official narrative satisfied legal requirements while avoiding speculation about unexplained elements. But Crow's personal notes contained observations that would haunt him for the remainder of his career. 7 children had demonstrated survival capabilities that exceeded adult expertise, navigated terrain that challenged experienced mountaineers, and organized evidence distribution that required scientific knowledge unavailable to elementary school students. The backpack preservation suggested advanced planning that contradicted emergency survival situations. The systematic placement of evidence across optimal discovery locations implied understanding of glacial dynamics that even professional researchers found challenging to predict accurately. Crow had investigated missing persons cases for 25 years without encountering evidence that so consistently defied rational explanation. His training taught him to follow facts regardless of their implications. But the Bus 12 evidence led toward conclusions that his rational mind could not accept. Sheriff Reed shared his professional frustration during their final case conference, acknowledging that public safety required closure even when private doubts remained unresolved. 7 families needed answers, and we provided the best explanation that available evidence supported. The case file would remain open technically, allowing for new evidence or witness testimony that might emerge in future years. But both investigators understood that 15 years of investigation had exhausted conventional methodology without producing complete understanding of what had occurred on December 14, 2010. Crow's retirement became permanent following completion of the Bus 12 investigation, his reputation enhanced by successful case closure, while his personal satisfaction remained incomplete. He had solved the geographical mystery of how 7 children had vanished while failing to explain their remarkable survival abilities. His final recommendation suggested that future missing persons investigations in wilderness areas should consider possibilities beyond traditional search and rescue protocols. The Bus 12 case had demonstrated that human capabilities could exceed documented limitations under extraordinary circumstances. The echo of unanswered questions would follow both investigators throughout their remaining careers, a reminder that some mysteries surpassed the boundaries of conventional law enforcement while demanding the same professional commitment that they provided to routine cases. Detective Crow understood that 7 children had experienced something that transformed them from ordinary students into individuals capable of extraordinary survival. But the nature of that transformation would remain forever beyond his ability to document or explain. The civil lawsuits filed by 7 families against Clearwater County School District concluded with settlements that provided financial compensation while avoiding admission of institutional responsibility for the December 2010 tragedy. District Attorney Aaron Sawyer had spent 2 years building cases that balanced the family's need for accountability with the legal reality that unprecedented weather conditions and extraordinary circumstances had contributed to events beyond reasonable institutional control. The evidence supported negligence claims while revealing systemic failures that extended beyond any single decision-maker. The school district's weather monitoring protocols had been adequate for normal winter conditions, but insufficient for the meteorological anomaly that had struck Elk Pass on December 14, 2010. Superintendent Linda Walsh testified that standard procedures had been followed, but those procedures had not anticipated the rapid deterioration that trapped Bus 12 in the mountains. Driver Len Wallace's employment record showed 25 years of safe mountain driving without accidents or safety violations, supporting his family's contention that his final decision to continue toward the school had been based on experience and professional judgment rather than reckless endangerment of student passengers. The settlements totaled $3.2 million distributed among 7 families, amounts calculated to provide educational funds for siblings and memorial scholarships that would honor the missing children's memory while supporting other students facing financial hardships. The financial resolution could not restore lost lives, but acknowledged institutional responsibility for policy improvements. Karen Price used her settlement to establish the Savannah Price Wildlife Foundation, a nonprofit organization that provided veterinary education scholarships for students pursuing careers in animal medicine. The foundation reflected her daughter's passionate interest in helping injured animals while creating positive legacy from devastating loss. Hector Martinez invested his family's settlement in expanding his auto repair business while establishing an annual soccer tournament that brought together teams from across Colorado to compete for the Diego Martinez Memorial Championship. The tournament raised funds for youth athletic programs in rural communities. The legal proceedings revealed systemic weaknesses in school transportation policies that affected districts throughout Colorado, leading to statewide reforms in weather monitoring, route cancellation procedures, and emergency communication protocols. The changes would prevent similar tragedies while honoring the memory of 7 children who had died exposing institutional vulnerabilities. But financial settlements and policy reforms could not address the deeper questions that the Bus 2 case had raised about survival, disappearance, and evidence preservation under impossible circumstances. The families received legal closure while continuing to wonder about their children's final experiences. District Attorney Sawyer concluded her involvement in the case with professional satisfaction at achieving fair settlements, while privately acknowledging that justice had been incomplete. 7 children had demonstrated extraordinary courage during their final hours, but the legal system could only address institutional failures rather than celebrating individual heroism. The settlement agreements included confidentiality clauses that prevented families from discussing specific evidence or testimony, ensuring that speculation about unexplained elements would not undermine public confidence in the investigation's conclusions or create conspiracy theories that might dishonor the children's memory. The Elk Glacier retreated 3 feet during the summer of 2025, revealing additional evidence that deepened the mystery of 7 missing children, while ensuring that their story would never be completely understood. Park Service researchers conducting routine climate monitoring discovered small objects emerging from the newly exposed ice: a child's mitten, pages from a field guide to mountain wildlife, and carved wooden tokens that appeared to be handmade trail markers. The artifact suggested that the children had spent extended time in the glacial environment, contradicting assumptions about rapid death from exposure. Dr. Ingrid Schultz analyzed the new evidence while acknowledging that each discovery challenged scientific understanding of survival in extreme conditions. The wooden tokens showed tool marks consistent with carving implements that elementary school students would not normally carry, suggesting that the children had acquired resources from unknown sources. The pages from the wildlife guide contained handwritten notes in margins, observations about animal behavior, and weather patterns that demonstrated knowledge beyond age-appropriate education levels. Someone had been teaching the children wilderness survival skills during their time in the glacial cave system. Public fascination with the Bus 12 case continued to generate speculation about what had happened during the 4-minute gap between the last traffic camera sighting and the dashboard clock's frozen timestamp. Online forums debated theories ranging from temporal anomalies to intervention by unknown individuals who had rescued the children temporarily. Sheriff Reed found herself fielding calls from paranormal investigators, documentary filmmakers, and amateur detectives who proposed explanations that ranged from plausible to absurd. The case had captured public imagination in ways that transcended normal missing persons investigations, becoming a modern mystery that invited endless speculation. The 7 memorial stones placed at backpack discovery sites became pilgrimage destinations for visitors who left flowers, toys, and handwritten messages expressing sympathy for the families while wondering about the children's extraordinary final journey. The glacier site transformed into an unofficial shrine to childhood courage and resilience. Climate scientists predicted that continued warming would expose the entire cave system within 20 years, potentially revealing additional evidence about how 7 children had survived for days or weeks in an environment where death should have occurred within hours. Future discoveries might finally explain the unexplainable. Detective Crow received periodic calls from investigators working similar cases across the American West, missing person situations that involved wilderness disappearances under circumstances that challenged conventional explanation. The Bus 12 evidence had established precedents for survival capabilities that exceeded documented human limitations. The children's families found peace in believing that Jonah, Chloe, Savannah, Diego, Caleb, Emily, and Malachi had experienced something extraordinary during their final days, an adventure that had tested their courage while demonstrating the remarkable resilience that adults often underestimated in young people. The mystery endured because it offered hope alongside tragedy, suggesting that human potential could transcend normal limitations when circumstances demanded extraordinary responses. 7 children had vanished into legend, leaving behind evidence of capabilities that challenged understanding while inspiring faith in human resilience. The glacier continued its relentless retreat, carrying secrets toward eventual revelation, while ensuring that complete answers would arrive only when time itself chose to release them from the mountain's frozen archives. Every spring, as Elk Glacier surrenders more of its ancient ice to climate change, researchers watch for new evidence from the case that redefined missing persons investigations in Colorado. The children's story has become a touchstone for families facing similar tragedies, proof that young people possess reserves of strength and courage that surface only when survival demands the impossible. 7 empty desks remain in Elk Pass Elementary's memorial classroom, preserved exactly as they appeared on December 14, 2010, when 7 children left for school and entered legend instead. Their backpacks have been returned to families who treasure them as evidence of lives lived with curiosity, creativity, and the kind of fearless wonder that transforms ordinary students into extraordinary survivors. The question that frames their story, who led 7 children into the storm, and where did the ice bury their footprints, remains unanswered, ensuring that their memory will endure as long as human beings seek to understand the mysteries that challenge the boundaries between the possible and the miraculous.